So for the second month in a row, we're having a speaker from the north of Scotland. Dr. Nicola Martin is a lecturer at the University of the Highlands and Islands. It is the Highlands and Islands, not the Islands and Highlands. And therefore, by the very nature of her university, she's quite used to giving online talks. Her area of speciality, as we'll discover this evening, is Jacobean period and the impact that warfare on that time had on the development or the American War of Independence. I'm not going to say any more because I'm going to get it wrong, Nicola. That's why we're here to listen to you this evening. If you'd like to put your slides up, I will now leave the stage and I will come back for the moderated Q&A session.
Thanks very much, Dudley. Good evening, everybody. Okay, so as the United States edges closer to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July the 4th, the White House has created a series of new videos as part of its, quote, Story of America, a website that's designed to familiarize Americans with their, quote, shared heritage and proud destiny. Now, the story told through these videos is a familiar one, retaining the traditional focus on the Founding Fathers, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Boston Massacre of 1770, and the Intolerable or Coercive Acts of 1774, and privileging political ideas and ideologies in explaining why the American Revolution occurred. Yet the story is much more complex and contested than America 250's curated video series suggests. And in my talk this evening, I'd like to take the opportunity to engage with some of that complexity and focus on some of the longer-term military, social, and cultural experiences and encounters that played a role in the coming of the revolution. And I want to do that through the lens of the British Army, which, with some notable exceptions, still tends to be viewed in studies of the revolutionary era either as little more than a blunt instrument of a coercive of parliament, or in terms of its commanders, as a series of brash, incompetent, and/or antagonistic officers whose actions demonstrate a failure to understand the imperial relationship or the realities of government in North America. Now, that the army was an instrument of empire is unquestionable, yet its officers ensured that it was more than simply this, in an era where, as Geoffrey Planck has demonstrated, the political power and public stature of the army was raised through its successful prosecution of the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745-46, which allowed officers to pursue a more deliberate imperial agenda. And a key aspect of this imperial agenda was the development of militarization strategy on imperial fringes that allowed Britain to wage war, secure territory, and both be in constant readiness for and attempt to prevent any future hostilities. Militarization strategy led to increased interaction between the military and civil spheres and ensured a range of encounters between both officers and soldiers and the various population groups of the British Empire. The role of army officers in the development and implementation of militarization strategy and in influencing imperial policy and shaping it on the ground ensured that whilst the army continued to function as an instrument of empire, officers themselves were also important agents of empire. Now, the army was first sent to North America in 1755, when 2 regiments under the command of Edward Braddock were tasked with removing the French from the Ohio country. Instead, Braddock was killed at the Battle of the Monongahela River, which jeopardized British influence in the region. The British response was to send further regiments under the command of a British officer, marking a clear shift in its North American military strategy that had until then largely relied upon provincial soldiers under the command of colonial governors to carry out campaigns. Britain's military commitment to North America grew as the French and Indian War continued, even as the conflict with France became more global in nature. And this commitment also continued in the aftermath of the war, as a significant standing army was retained in North America, primarily to secure British territorial gains in Canada and the Floridas. Within 12 years, it would be employed against the Patriots during the Revolutionary War, or, in the eyes of the British Army, against those who were rebelling against the Crown, as the Jacobites had 30 years earlier. So the intention of this paper then is to consider the experiences of the British Army as it implemented its militarisation strategy in North America from the 1750s. But in order to understand the situation there, I want to start here in Scotland during the 45, where militarisation strategy was first put into practice in the Highlands, and where army officers were confronted with questions of imperial identity, loyalty, and subjecthood. I'll then focus on the experiences and interactions of the army in North America, where officers took earlier experiences of pacification and militarisation with them and adapted them to the conditions they found on a new imperial fringe. At the same time, encounters with not only colonial settlers, but also French Canadians and Indigenous peoples forced officers to again confront and adjust their understandings of imperial identity and loyalty. And I'll argue that in doing so, army officers played a material role in the coming of the American Revolution. Now, ideas of subjecthood, loyalty, and identity were paramount in the 18th century British Empire in the wake of the Anglo-Scottish Union of 1707 and in the context of an expanding empire. Imperial officials were concerned with the obligations owed to the British state by its peoples, both domestic and overseas, whilst the various population groups who constituted the British Empire were concerned with their individual and collective rights. And just as warfare and empire building contributed to the gradual development of a recognisably British identity throughout the 18th century, such pursuits increasingly raised new questions about who was to be considered a British subject, with all the rights and protections, as well as obligations that entailed. Scottish Highlanders fit awkwardly within a framework of inclusive Britishness and were instead viewed as others, associated with incivility, alien customs and language, and the clan system. This led British Army officers and government officials to deliberately characterise the 45 as a Highland rebellion, despite support for Jacobitism being widespread throughout Scotland and extending in a limited way to the north of England. By othering Highlanders, British officers treated that region as an uncivilised periphery, notably different from the civilised centre, and one that represented a threat to British liberties, the British state, and the empire. And they likewise denied the rights of that population as subjects, justifying the use of violence to force submission of such others to the crown. Now, Geoffrey Plank argued that such a characterisation caused British Army officers not only to label Jacobites as criminals who were guilty of treason, but also to view the general Highland population as savages, guilty of Jacobitism and disloyalty by association. And this encouraged a blurring of the military and civil spheres and caused the army, under William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, to engage in a punitive campaign of military execution against the population at large during and after the rebellion. Little or no distinction was made between those who had been fighting for the Jacobites and those who had not, with the population's supposed collective disloyalty used by army officers as justification for their actions. And Cumberland expressed this feeling of general disloyalty when he argued that, quote, "the Jacobite rebellious principle is so rooted in this nation that this generation must be pretty well worn out before this country will be quiet." And he advocated the deportation of several clans to the West Indies. Similar understandings were widespread in the ministry. the Earl of Chesterfield argued that, quote, while that favourable distinction remains of loyal and disloyal, the rebellion will never be extinguished. He urged the recall of, quote, your Scotch heroes, meaning the independent Highland companies, and called for Cumberland to put all, quote, to fire and sword. Now, not all shared such a conception of Highland disloyalty, or thought that punitive measures were the most effective way to secure peace in the region. The questions that were being raised by the Jacobite rebellion had no agreed upon answers. Some army officers, including John Campbell, Earl of Loudoun, worked and negotiated with loyalist and neutral Highlanders during the 45. In doing so, men like Loudoun demonstrated a more inclusive understanding of subjecthood that accepted that some Highlanders were already loyal subjects and demonstrated a belief that accommodation of those not actively rebelling was a better way to inculcate loyalty than acting punitively. Loudoun expressed such an attitude when he asked how he ought to treat surrendering Jacobite officers, suggesting that if low-ranking officers were treated with clemency, then the army, quote, would have the whole surrender immediately. But given the majority shared Cumberland's conception of Highland disloyalty, and given the commander had the, quote, king's entire approbation of his Highland strategy, the pacification was bound to follow his punitive model. One thing that all agreed upon was that loyalty demanded the allegiance of the individual to the crown and to the state, and that required the subversion of local loyalties at the family or the clan level. And this was believed to require long-term measures, which centred on military occupation and intimidation on one hand, and the civilization and assimilation of the Highlanders on the other. Few of the steps that were taken were novel, as the British drew on earlier examples to guide them, but they did represent a significant intervention in the region through a deliberate militarisation strategy. 10,000 troops occupied Scotland in March 1747, with the majority posted to the Highlands during the summers in order to undertake patrols. Although the number fell over time, around 800 regulars remained on duty patrolling the Highlands in 1756, a decade after Culloden, and at a time when Britain was at war with France and when Highlanders were serving in the British Army. There was also substantial investment in military infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and forts. A chain of garrisons, of which the imposing and expensive Fort George was the jewel in the crown, was created to facilitate military patrols, whilst a military survey was created first of the Highlands and later of the whole country. In addition to providing intelligence and tactical support, the Roy map was aimed to act as a method of military intimidation and imposition, and to enable effective governance of a remote, from London, occupied region. And whilst intimidation sought to prevent renewed rebellion, civilization and assimilation were thought necessary to inculcate loyalty in the longer term. A key step in this process was the annexation of 13 of the Highland estates that had been forfeited to the Crown after the rebellion. The wording of the Act drew on ideas emerging in Enlightenment debates around stadial theory and linked civilization and commercialization with long-term security, because the purpose of the annexation was noted to be, quote, for the better civilizing and improving the Highlands of Scotland and preventing disorders there for the future. For the first time, land forfeiture would be utilised not simply to raise revenue, but to manage the estates as models of improvement, industry, and commerce. The Commission was tasked with investing profits to effect more general improvements in the Highlands, funding manufacturing, developing communications, and establishing planned villages. And they also worked closely with the Society in Scotland for Propagating Christian Knowledge to establish charity schools to teach English and placing Presbyterian ministers in Highland parishes. And just as Enlightenment thinkers had their own debates about how best to effect improvement, military officers and government officials had different ideas about what measures to take, and other priorities influenced the investment in both money and time that was put into the Highlands. As Matthew Unique has demonstrated, this allowed Highland elites to reshape policies for their own ends. And over time, it was clear that measures on the ground had not led to the commercialisation of Highland society or the civilisation of the population. However, the British imperial elite believed that the measures had been successful in ensuring long-term security. This was greatly helped by the recruitment of Highlanders into the British Army from 1756, which again raised questions as to whether accommodation might be a more effective way of ensuring loyalty. By the 1760s, attitudes towards the Highlanders began to shift, and the alienness of the population was gradually eroded. Crucially for the British state, Highlanders were displaying domestic and imperial loyalty and therefore allegiance to the crown. They were not civilised Britons, but experiences pacifying that population suggested that perhaps imperial population groups could demonstrate loyalty even if they were not assimilated, raising potential new opportunities for subjecthood. And less than a decade after the British defeated the Jacobites, the security of the British Empire was again under threat, this time due to the French and Indian War. What began as a localised confrontation between Britain and France to the rights for the Ohio Country in 1754 quickly escalated into a worldwide struggle for supremacy that lasted until 1763. In 1759, the British laid siege to Quebec and drew on and adapted earlier experiences in Scotland as they faced similar difficulties defining their enemy during the conflict and in pacifying hostile others and in implementing militarisation strategy on another imperial fringe after the conquest. So in Quebec, the British faced an external enemy rather than internal rebels, but there were similarities between the two theatres. Facing irregulars as well as the French regulars, the British struggled to get to grips with their enemy and to differentiate combatants and non-combatants amidst what Matthew Ward has identified as an early example of total warfare in North America. Commander James Wolfe, who had been active during the 45, undertook a campaign of destruction to subjugate French Canadians that was reminiscent of that undertaken against the Highlanders. The reason for such an approach was twofold. First, the army hoped to foster a level of civilian discontent that would force the French to engage in a pitched battle. The second related to how British officers identified French Canadians. Unlike the Jacobites, they were not subjects of the British Crown, but subjects of the French, and as such, they ought to have been treated as the civilian population of an enemy of war. Indeed, when the army first arrived in the River St. Lawrence, Wolfe had issued a proclamation promising to spare civilians if they took no part in the campaign. And he noted that, quote, "The resolution the Canadians ought to take is by no means doubtful. The utmost exertion of their valour will be entirely useless and will only serve to deprive them of the advantages that they might enjoy by their neutrality. The cruelties of the French against the subjects of Great Britain and America would excuse the most severe reprisals, but English men are too generous to follow such barbarous examples. They offer to the Canadians the sweets of peace amidst the horrors of war. It is left to themselves to determine their fate by their conduct." Wolfe suggested that the French had already committed outrages of the laws of war, referencing the 1757 massacre at Fort William Henry, when France's Indigenous allies had killed the surrendering garrison. That alone would have been sufficient for the British to justify reprisals, but Wolfe sought to set a claim for British moral superiority. When French Canadians continued to serve the French war effort, with men mobilized in the militia and women and children employed transporting supplies and intelligence gathering, he therefore claimed that they were enemy combatants and had denied themselves any protection that they might have been entitled to through the laws of war. Now, the campaign of destruction against Quebec ended after the British victory at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham on 13 September 1759 and the surrender of the city 5 days later. Yet Britain's hold on the city and the surrounding area throughout the winter and spring of 1759-60 was fragile, as James Murray, who took command after Wolfe's death, had just 7,000 troops with which to maintain control over the city, the surrounding area, and the inhabitants. It wasn't until the capitulation of Montreal in September 1760 that the British secured their conquest. With that capitulation, the British Army, led by Geoffrey Amherst, classified the French Canadians as having become the King's subjects, and Canada, quote, a part of the King's dominion, as much as any other colony in America, despite the widespread belief that the territory would be returned to France upon the eventual peace. Now, the Catholic French-speaking population were clearly not Britons, but by classifying them as the King's subjects, the army granted them the same rights and responsibilities as others within the empire. But again, drawing on the Highland precedent, that did not mean that allegiance could be guaranteed, and instead the British sought to ensure it with a combination of military intimidation and long-term assimilation, with similar questions raised over whether to civilize or accommodate the population. And the army drew on earlier experiences in its extension of militarisation strategy in Canada. Immediately after the conquest of Montreal, the population was disarmed and required to swear an oath of fidelity, submitting to British authority. Manifestos were published informing civilians of the terms of the surrender, and militiamen were only allowed to return to their farms to gather their harvest after complying. The army used an implicit threat of deportation as part of its Canadian strategy. Should they choose to, the British could remove anyone that they found disruptive, or even the entire population, transporting them to France or deporting them to other British colonies in North America. Whilst the Articles of Capitulation theoretically guaranteed the population security in their homes, the deportation of the Acadians in 1755, which had taken place over 40 years after British control in Nova Scotia had been determined by the Treaty of Utrecht, was a fearsome precedent. Although the British had no intention of repeating the Acadian deportation in Quebec, the implicit threat of removal remained, and it was an effective intimidatory measure. At the same time, investment in military infrastructure and a large-scale mapping project of the St. Lawrence Valley region again sought not only to provide intelligence about a geographical fringe, but to act as a method of subjugation and intimidation over the population. Murray, aware of the Roy map and the rationale that had driven it, took the lead in the mapping project in Quebec, ordering surveys and a census that detailed the number of men capable of bearing arms in each parish. And questions of loyalty and subjecthood remained to the fore, and the Proclamation of 1763 sought the Anglicisation of Quebec through the replacement of French institutions and the Catholic religion. Anglicisation was thought a necessary step for the assimilation of French Canadians who could eventually become British subjects. James Murray, now governor of Quebec, was ordered to summon and call a General Assembly in the same manner and form as those in the older colonies, as soon as the, quote, state and circumstances of the province allowed. His instructions signalled the ministry's intention that the Catholic population be, quote, induced to embrace the Protestant religion, and their children be brought up in the principles of it. This was to be achieved primarily through the encouragement of Protestant settlement into planned Protestant villages. It was hoped the establishment of such schools and churches would encourage conversion, particularly of the younger generation, thereby civilizing the population and helping to assimilate them. Now, whilst Murray shared the ministry's aspirations, his experiences led him to believe that toleration, at least in the short term, would better ensure the loyalty of the French Canadians. As such, he utilised the flexibility in his instructions, refusing to call an assembly that would have given the 200 Protestants rule over approximately 70,000 French Canadian Catholics. He also appointed French Canadians to the provincial council, changed the court system to provide a mixture of Canadian civil and English criminal law, and allowed French Canadians to serve on juries and as lawyers. And Murray's actions stemmed largely from practicality, as the expected levels of Protestant immigration simply did not materialise. But there was also evidence of a shift in his understanding of imperial loyalty and identity at the same time that similar shifts were occurring in relation to the Highlanders. Murray believed that the French Canadians had the potential to become loyal subjects of the Crown. He argued that they were, quote, perhaps the best and bravest race upon the globe, who, if granted toleration, quote, would soon get the better of every national antipathy towards their conquerors and become the most faithful set of men in this American empire. He remained convinced that loyalty was a necessity for imperial security, but his experiences in Quebec suggested that Anglicisation and assimilation were not necessary precedents for such loyalty, and that accommodation might be more effective. As in Scotland, this opened new possibilities around imperial subjecthood. Such subjects had the same rights and responsibilities as Britons, but close regulation over them continued to be thought necessary. And such an understanding was eventually enshrined in the Quebec Act of 1774, when the ministry formally dropped its policy of Anglicisation. Now, the place of Indigenous peoples in Britain's empire, both during and after the French and Indian War, was a more contested issue than the place of conquered French Canadians. During the war, various Indigenous nations, tribes, and confederacies had acted to secure their own interests, whether allying with the British, fighting against them, or simply remaining neutral in the conflict. Very few had been militarily conquered by the British, and many, including the Haudenosaunee, Shawnee, and Lenape, had conversely secured significant tracts of land and hunting rights from the British, alongside promises that the army would vacate the interior once the war was over. Despite this, after the conquest of Canada in 1760, British Commander Geoffrey Amherst viewed Indigenous peoples as having been subjugated by Crown forces and being unworthy of and unentitled to any rights as subjects of the Crown. Whereas inhabitants of Canada, the Floridas, and the Illinois country, Amherst accepted as imperial subjects following the conquest. He believed that the Indigenous peoples were both savage and inferior, both reliant upon and subject to British authority, with no practical or legal alternative but to accept subjugation. Although few army officers or ministers shared Amherst's conviction that Indigenous peoples posed little threat to British security, his denial of imperial rights to the population was broadly accepted, at least in theory. But however Amherst and the British viewed Indigenous peoples, that was not how any viewed their own relationship to the Crown. Indian Superintendent William Johnson noted that Indigenous peoples had no word that could convey the meaning of subjection, and the very idea of it would, quote, fill them with horror. They viewed themselves not as subjects of the Crown, and certainly not as subjugated, but rather most saw themselves as unconquered in the late war, and as having successfully negotiated British guarantees for future trading and land rights. But it was Amherst's understanding of the status and imperial identity of Indigenous peoples that drove Britain's militarisation strategy in the interior from 1760. Following the Highland example, troops were spread throughout garrisons, including impressive structures at Forts Pitt, Detroit, Michilimackinac, and Crown Point, as well as smaller stockades, including Miami and Presque Isle. Troops were ordered to improve fortifications and construct or improve roads and portages to open access both to and throughout the interior. Again, such steps sought not only to intimidate the local population through a show of British military might, but also to enable the army to respond more quickly to any future disorder. Adapting militarisation strategy in the Highlands to the conditions of the interior, the army sought to regulate commercial interactions. Restricting gifts of arms and ammunition sought to subjugate Indigenous peoples in the short term, whilst an emphasis on developing and regulating settler Indigenous trade reflected a longer-term desire to civilise and eventually assimilate the population. At the same time, Amherst believed that limiting the diplomatic policy of gift-giving was a simple way to comply with his ministerial orders to reduce expense. He thought the conquered Indigenous peoples would have no choice but to simply accept such a change. But Amherst's subjugatory strategy failed in the context of Indigenous resentment at British and settler actions. Continuing acts of violence demonstrated that Indigenous peoples remained a clear threat to British imperial security, conquered or not. Amherst received regular reports of violence, and from Superintendent Johnson of widespread discontent. Johnson warned him that the Indigenous peoples in the Ohio country, including the Shawnee and the Lenape, were, quote, very jealous and uneasy at the coolness and indifference which they think is shown towards them, leaving Johnson, quote, apprehensive that something not right was brewing amongst them. When discontent coalesced into the pan-Indigenous uprisings, often known as Pontiac's War, in 1763, Amherst still believed that the British military superiority meant that it would not represent a serious challenge to British security. During Pontiac's War, Amherst defined his Indigenous enemies as rebels, decrying the, quote, barbarous, treacherous, and vain schemes of the villains. In his mind, they owed their allegiance to the crown, yet were manifestly disloyal, and as savages, denied themselves the benefits of the laws of war. He encouraged the targeting of entire tribes whose warriors had attacked British posts, advocating the killing of women and children, and he reintroduced monetary rewards for scalps. At the same time, James Murray was adapting to the situation on the ground in Canada and gaining a new understanding of imperial subjecthood. Amherst returned to Britain during Pontiac's War with his own understanding of Indigenous people as inferior savages who had to be subjugated rather than accommodated, reinforced, despite the failure of his policies. But Amherst's replacement by Thomas Gage marked a change in understanding and a policy that was more akin to Murray's in Quebec. Gage moved away from subjugation, civilization, and assimilation, and towards accommodation and diplomacy as he sought to secure long-term peace in the interior. Unlike Amherst, Gage termed Pontiac's war a conflict or a war rather than a rebellion or an insurrection, recognizing the independent status of the nations, accepting that they were unconquered, and that they represented a genuine military threat. This recognition of their authority left him aware that the army first had to secure their submission to the crown. He believed this would be best achieved through military intimidation during the war, in other words, by forcing them to sue for peace. In the long term, he believed that accommodation would be the most effective strategy. Like Murray, Gage came to believe that assimilation was not a necessary prerequisite for loyalty. As such, he hoped that reforming Britain's Indian policy might remove grievances related to land encroachment and trade, thereby encouraging Indigenous peoples to remain loyal. The peace that was concluded saw the Shawnee, Mingo, and Lenape style themselves as, quote, children of the great King of England, deeming themselves thereby closer linked to the British Crown, to whom they will pay all due submission and subjection. Although still not considered subjects, Gage viewed Indigenous peoples as more closely linked to the British than ever, another imperial population of others who were to be considered when policies were made and to be protected from colonial ills. In return, they were expected to obey the authority of the king and his imperial agents. Now, such experiences suggested two important things to army officers who were concerned with implementing empire in North America. First, militarization had shown that assimilation was not a necessary precedent for securing the loyalty of imperial populations. In both Scotland and Quebec, the population was displaying submission and adherence to the state, despite the fact that they had certainly not been anglicised or assimilated. And this forced a rethinking regarding the status of population groups within the empire, who came to be seen as imperial subjects or imperial populations with rights and responsibilities as part of the empire like Britons, yet who were clearly differentiated from Britons at home. And second, such imperial subjects needed to be closely regulated, and military pacification and intimidation were considered essential tools for ensuring imperial security. There was no room for an empire of negotiation in the way that the imperial relationship with the colonists had functioned for many years. And at the same time, army officers were shaping new identities for imperial others as a result of their experiences on these imperial fringes. The British identity of colonial North American settlers was simultaneously eroded. The process began first during the French and Indian War, when successive commanders were left frustrated when colonists failed to act as the commanders believed it was their duty to as Britons by complying with demands for assistance for the common prosecution of the war. It was consolidated in the aftermath of the war as tensions solidified when British militarization strategy was extended. This led to calls for closer regulation and later military pacification of the colonists, who by the 1760s were not seen as Britons, but as others, and indeed as potential rebels. Now, the Earl of Loudon, who had worked with Loyalist Highlanders during the 45, took charge of the British forces in 1756 and immediately served notice of his expectation of cooperation and compliance in a letter to colonial governors. Loudon inquired, quote, "What assistance may I depend on you from your province in men or money?" But he underestimated the extent of intercolonial jealousy and the power struggles between the colonial assemblies and colonial governors, as well as the very different understandings that army officers and colonists had regarding colonial rights and obligations. Loudon repeatedly struggled to persuade colonial assemblies to provide him with the numbers of soldiers requested or to find suitable quarters for his troops. In 1756, only New York complied with his request for emergency troops to counter a possible French advance after the loss of Fort Oswego. The other colonies delayed answering Loudoun's request or simply refused to comply, considering the year as, quote, so far advanced, and they were, quote, exhausted both of men and money. Now, although Loudon took steps to mitigate the difficulties he encountered, he equated colonial responses with disloyalty, informing Captain General Cumberland that they, quote, have assumed to themselves what they call rights and privileges, totally unknown in the mother country, and are made use of for no purpose but to screen them from giving any aid of any sort. He later complained that he had found, quote, not only a general backwardness in every colony, but even almost in every individual on this continent, to aid in carrying on the public service. Now, his view of the colonists was shaped by his focus on his military task, and he complained that they caused delays and added expense to the service. Their failure to act as expected suggested to Loudon that they were not loyal Britons. Instead, he and other officers came to classify them as others. Now, it wasn't a static interpretation, and it was at this point confined to military affairs, but it provides an early indication of changing attitudes within the army towards the colonists. And the shift in attitude was consolidated under Thomas Gage in the aftermath of the war. The end of the war could have allowed tensions to dissipate and officers to revert to their pre-war understandings of colonists' identity, but instead the shift solidified. The proclamation of 1763 signalled that the army had taken control over the interior, but Gage believed that the colonists shared responsibility for protecting it. Additionally, he felt that the colonists ought to support troops who were garrisoned in colonial towns. His reasoning was that the purpose of retaining the army in North America was for imperial security, which benefited the colonies as well as Britain. However, colonial assemblies and civilians who were recovering from a long and economically damaging conflict didn't consider it their responsibility to provide men or supplies to overcome rebellion in a region that the proclamation banned them from settling in or reaping any financial reward from. And they also objected to the army's calls to quarter or supply troops who were stationed in their own colonies, as they didn't believe there was any need for them to be there. Instead, they thought British troops should only be kept in the newly acquired territories and, if essential, in the interior. Such attitudes became increasingly entrenched as colonists linked the stationing of the army with the British attempts to tax the colonists during the imperial crisis and protested, sometimes violently, British actions. During the Stamp Act crisis, Thomas Gage placed emphasis on colonial disaffection and disloyalty, implicitly referencing the differences between colonists and Britons and othering the former. He warned his subordinates to be ready to attack colonists if necessary, noting that, quote, if they dare fire upon the king's troops and become rebels, you will give them a good dressing and beat these sons of liberty into loyal subjects. In doing so, Gage identified the colonists as a clear threat to British imperial security and urged a military pacification to subjugate them if they crossed the line into rebellion. And this continued during the imperial crisis as Gage encouraged the ministry to implement stronger legislative measures and to use military intimidation to enable closer regulation of the colonists. In 1769, discussing the non-importation agreement and a concern that colonists might attack British merchant ships, Gage informed Lieutenant Colonel Dalrymple in Boston that, quote, if any accident happens to the goods, the proprietors will, from their consequence at home, be better able to procure redress and show the British nation the American provinces are no longer British. For French or Spaniards would do no more upon the eve of a war with Great Britain than to prohibit all trade with her. Such a statement reinforced Gage's attitude that the colonists were not Britons and were not partners in a negotiated empire, as the colonists believed they were. Rather, he demonstrated that he considered them simply one more group of imperial others that had to be managed within the empire. And given this particular group of others, who were subordinate to British authority, stood upon the brink of rebellion, Gage saw no reason to accommodate them within the empire as the British were accommodating French Canadians and Indigenous peoples. Instead, he advocated measures that had successfully pacified other hostile population groups in Scotland and North America previously. And such an understanding was further entrenched by the army's changing strategy for securing peace in the interior. With colonial settlement banned and the army employed to remove illegal settlers in the interior, frontiersmen claimed that the army was protecting Indigenous peoples at the expense of their own security. They engaged in preemptive attacks on Indigenous peoples and failed to surrender those who were suspected of murder, leading Gage to argue that, quote, "it is always best when they," meaning Indigenous peoples, "take immediate satisfaction," suggesting that the army would ignore any proportionate revenge attacks. Blaming frontiersmen for continuing violence, Gage and his subordinates accused them of being, quote, "lawless villains, acting in a wantonly cruel or barbaric manner," replicating some of the language that had previously been used to describe Indigenous peoples and associating the frontiersmen with savagery. He again emphasized their disloyalty and othered the population, suggesting that they had forfeited the rights and protections they were due through their actions. For most Britons at home, a shift in how they understood colonists' identity only occurred during the course of the Revolutionary War. But for Thomas Gage and many others within the British Army in North America, the colonists were no longer considered Britons well before the conflict actually broke out. So militarisation strategy in Scotland and North America caused army officers to come into repeated and prolonged contact with various population groups in the empire from the 1740s and 50s onwards. These encounters, in turn, caused officers to confront and adjust their understandings of imperial loyalty and identity. Absorbing other populations, officers began to question the assumption that Britishness was a necessary prerequisite for loyalty and gradually moved away from assimilation towards accommodation, coupled with ongoing military intimidation in order to secure adherence to the crown. Failing to effectively accommodate colonial settlers who continued to view themselves as partners in empire rather than as simply as imperial subjects, militarisation and the associated social and cultural encounters led to the unmaking of the colonists' British identity in the eyes of officers. Othering colonial settlers, officers questioned the sustainability of an empire of negotiation and instead began advocating imperial reform as early as 1756. And as the colonies began to edge closer to rebellion, those officers drew upon prior experiences to urge the military pacification of a hostile population group in order to ensure imperial security. And in doing so, Thomas Gage and other army officers acted as important agents of empire and played a material role in the coming of the American Revolution. Thank you very much.
Nicola, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I stopped counting the number of times the phrase othering appeared in that, but there's no doubt that it's the correct term to use. You mentioned that Cumberland believed that he had the approbation of the king, and I think you suggest that Amherst felt in the same way. Did they?
Yeah, so yes and no. It's a complicated one. Cumberland did receive letters from Newcastle, the Secretary of State, that said specifically that he had the King's entire approbation for what he was doing. Quite quickly, the mood started to change and questions started to be raised as to what was happening in the Highlands and whether they were going a bit too far. And you can see the government ministers starting to distance themselves slightly from the army and try and sort of say, oh, it's the army doing that, it's not us. But certainly Cumberland was acting not on the King's orders, but with the King's blessing of what he was doing in the Highlands. Amherst, it's slightly more complicated by the fact that he's so far away across the Atlantic, in that he basically is allowed to do what he wants as commander-in-chief as long as he gets the results. And when Pontiac's War breaks out, he's not recalled in disgrace, but what he's been doing for a number of years has been asking to go home, and all of a sudden he's now allowed to go home. So he kind of comes home, and people are starting to ask those questions as to what were you doing, because you didn't quite get it right there. So yes, Cumberland definitely has the King's approbation in terms of what he's doing, but once questions in the public start to get asked, the ministry starts to distance itself slightly. Similarly, in North America, they're quite happy to be hands off, but when war breaks out or rebellion breaks out, as they see it, then they start to say, oh, that's not quite happening the way we wanted it to happen.
Yeah, thank you. And it leads me on to my next question, which is really, where is London getting its information from? Is it entirely from the army officers and people like Amherst and later Gage, or are there diplomats, for want of a better word, there as well?
Yeah, it's a mixture. So the army officers who are attempting to influence policy making aren't the only voices, aren't the only ones with skin in the race. So they are putting their points forward. But at the same time, you've got colonial governors who are writing home. You've got the representatives of the colonial assemblies who are often on the opposite side, because they're not appointed by the king. So they are actually appointed by the colonists themselves. So there's quite often a clash there in terms of what both sides want. You've also got like the Indian superintendents and other diplomats, all of whom have an idea of what's the best option. So I think I mentioned that point about there being no agreed upon answers. So everyone has their idea. So at times the army officers are very successful in pushing, and at times they're not. So for example, Gage, he's pushing for a much more restrictive policy towards the colonies from really as soon as he takes charge. But it's only in the sort of 1770s and really up to 1774 before he actually gets what he's been asking for.
Thank you. It's a long time since I've been on the battlefield at Culloden, but I was on the Heights of Abraham about 2 years ago and spent a fascinating 3 days walking around Quebec, in the heights and the city, etc. And your talk brought it all home to me. I really enjoyed that. There are some questions coming in. I would encourage more to come in. Please write them in the chat box. But I'll ask Magnus's question first. How did other countries regard and treat rebels?
Oh, that's a good question. It's not something I've done a huge amount of work on in terms of comparative aspects, but in terms of the laws of war, which were the kind of agreed upon values and norms that the European countries were working towards and sort of working with, they were very similar. So the idea starting to change in this period. So in 1759, you have Emmer de Vatel's work, which is really important for understanding the laws of war. Up to that point, they're really relying on Grotius's work. With Vatel, there's a real push towards more moderation in warfare. And there's an argument that although rebels, because they're acting treasonously, it's justifiable for the army to kind of put them to death and treat them not as being subject to the laws of war. There is an increasing push towards moderation. So in this period, we do have that increased idea of moderation being the right way to treat rebels, to a lesser extent those who are believed to be uncivilized. So the values that the British are working within are very much Enlightenment values, and they're very much ones that are shared by European nations. So that's why you see during the French and Indian War, actually both the British and the French accusing each other of atrocities in terms of the various actions of either the army themselves or their indigenous allies. So yeah, there is quite a lot of similarity there in terms of how other European, certainly European countries, I don't want to talk any wider than that, but how other European countries would also treat those that were seen to be rebels.
Mark's asked this, can you speak to the Irish experience in the same period? Many of the points you make seem equally applicable to the British Army in Ireland, dating back to the actions of the late 17th century.
Thanks very much. I don't want to speak to the Irish experience other than to say that, yes, a lot of the, as I said in the talk, the measures that the British were putting in place in the Highlands after Culloden were not new. And Ireland was absolutely one of the places they'd tried some of these measures previously, also in Scotland and in the Highlands previously as well, back into the 16th and 17th century. So the different policies weren't new. What's quite different in the post-Culloden period is the way that a strategy is pulled together so that everything comes together and all the different aspects line up, rather than it being, oh, we'll try military roads here, or we'll try this. It's actually everything's pulled together as a sort of deliberate strategy. Not one that's entirely successful, but one that is very much thought to be the way forward.
Thank you. Before I take the next question, I really ought to share the link to your flyer, which I've put up on the screen as a download. There is a discount available. I'm certain that many of the people in the room still this evening would be interested in this subject. I'd like to pose another question for myself, and maybe it's a question that General Alistair Irwin, who's in the audience, might have put himself. I'd like to know more about the Highland regiments at this stage, because certainly in the late 18th century, they are at the forefront of empire in terms of how the British Army is acting in places like Afghanistan and Southern Africa. Would you like to say anything about about the loyalty now, I suppose, of these Highland regiments and how they're acting?
Yeah, I can. I think the first thing I would say is when we think of the Highland regiments, we think of the troops that were recruited from the 7 Years' War onwards, so from 1756 onwards. But there were Highland troops fighting for the British during the Jacobite Rebellion as well. So there were independent Highland companies that had been raised. They date back to the early 17th century when they were first raised, and they're raised and disbanded at various points. So there are loyalist Highlanders who are fighting for the British during the Jacobite Rising, and that's why it's very much seen as being a civil war as much as it is a rebellion, or as being sort of any sort of nationalist Scottish Jacobite endeavour as well. They're not trusted at all, and we see that with Chesterfield sort of saying, oh, they need to be brought back, and eventually then we get the recruitment of the actual sort of official Highland regiments from 1756 during the war. What's really interesting there is you have people like Simon Fraser, Master of Lovat, who was out for the Jacobites during the 45, who are then a decade later recruited into the British Army. And Fraser of Lovat's most famous for leading the charge up the plains or up the cliffs to get to the Plains of Abraham, and playing a really important part in the Battle at Quebec as well. They're so sort of famous because they very quickly gain a really strong reputation as good, as loyal, and as tactically strong warriors. So the idea very quickly changes, and they're kind of the perceived militarism of the Highlands kind of does them a favor in that regard, because they're automatically seen as they have that military aspect to them. They are a warrior nation, even though some of those militaristic aspects had kind of been dying out by the time of the 45. But those who are recruited into the empire, into the British Army, really use it as an opportunity to rehabilitate themselves, or not rehabilitate themselves, but in the eyes of the state, rehabilitate themselves, and to really gain from the opportunities of imperial service. So you do see sort of significant numbers. They do stay loyal to the British during the American Revolution. One of the big questions I always get asked is whether those who were involved in the Jacobite risings then actually fought for the Patriots during the American Revolution. And yes, there are some, but there are far more who actually fight for the British during the American Revolutionary War, partly because they've had the experience of being on the losing side, but also because a lot of them have had that experience of being part of the imperial empire and seeing what benefits they can actually get from that service.
Okay, Mark, again, is this significantly different from the militaristic model posited by Stephen Saunders Webb, who traced this model back to Tudor Stuart practice?
So it's not that it's significantly different. I think it's just showing the transatlantic nature of the army in this time, and the fact that they are learning lessons, but also adapting those lessons to the different conditions that they face in different parts of the empire. So yeah, again, as with the question in terms of Ireland, there's nothing in this period that is particularly revolutionary about the British Army. What it is very much an army of adaptation, one that is looking at what's worked in the past, what hasn't worked in the past, and trying it in new places, adapting it to the conditions that it finds on the ground in those different places.
Zachary says, Dr. Martin, thank you for this excellent talk. Could you speak to the impact on policies of accommodation on other groups? Specifically, how the accommodations given to French Canadians regarding language, law, and religion under the Quebec Act of 1774 was a headline intolerable act which many provincial Americans saw with such approbation.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a great question. It's you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of accommodating one group means that another group is often not happy, and that happens again and again. And James Murray is actually a really good example of it, because he really advocates for toleration of French Canadians and accommodation of French Canadians in Quebec while he's governor there, and as military governor as well. But he has a very, very bad relationship with the British mercantile population that also settles. So the Protestant population of Quebec gets on very badly with them, and they basically see what he's doing in terms of trying to support the French Canadians as being directly against their rights and what they are entitled to as subjects. So they're expecting to basically come in and take control of the governance of that province, and what he does basically stops them from being able to do so. And we see the same thing in the interior as well, with Gage's attempts to accommodate Indigenous peoples and to try and prevent the land encroachment that is one of the biggest complaints of Indigenous peoples. And in doing so, the frontier settlers turn around and say, you are basically protecting Indigenous peoples who have been killing us, and not protecting us, which is what you're supposed to be doing. So yeah, accommodating one group really does have consequences on how empire functions, and it's a really significant aspect for that deteriorating relationship between the army officers and the army on the ground and the colonial settlers, who are starting to think towards basically resisting British measures and trying to push for policy reversals.
Nicola, that's the last of the questions this evening. On behalf of the Society of Army Historical Research, can I once again thank you so much for giving up your time this evening, but also for delivering what I found a really fascinating talk. And I know that we've got a much larger than normal attendance from North America this evening, who are clearly very interested in what you were delivered to us this evening. And with that, I'm going to say goodnight to all. And once again, thank you very much indeed, Nicola.
Thanks very much, Dudley. Thanks.
Good night, all.